Welcome to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcast on state aid in the European Union.
Under EU rules, state aid is not allowed unless it has a social character or it is used to promote economic development. For example, when tackling the challenges of global competition, the ongoing financial crisis, the digital revolution, or demographic change.
The European Parliament agrees with this general principle, but calls for less and better targeted state aid in the future. Want to know more? Stay with us.
Adam Smith's invisible hand theory, according to which a self-regulatory market force would automatically bring markets to equilibrium through the free demand and supply mechanism, has proven to barely work in practice. It was never really embraced by EU member states.
And actually all of them use state aid to support their economies, albeit to varying degrees. So what is state aid exactly?
The European Commission defines state aid as an advantage given by government that may provide a company with an unfair competitive edge over its commercial rivals. Such state aid can be delivered in many different ways, for example, through the allocation of grant subsidies, the provision of interest and tax relief, or the purchasing of goods and services on preferential terms.
EU rules generally prohibit state aid unless it is deemed necessary to stimulate the economy, and it falls on the European Commission to ensure that they're applied and observed equally across the Union.
So under which circumstances would state aid be considered compatible with the internal market?
Well, aid having a social character and granted to individual consumers, for example, or aid to promote the economic development of regions which are lagging behind or have serious unemployment problems, even aid to carry out an important project of common European interest.
For instance, environmental projects. In 2017, over half of all state aid in the EU went to initiatives aimed at protecting the environment and saving energy, which is one of the top priorities of the Union for the coming years.
Now let's look at some examples of state aid in the EU. Stay with us.
Let's start with the economic support for the coal mining industry. Coal is still mined in 12 member states, and coal-fired power plants operate in 21 of the now 27 member states, employing 238,000 people. But two-thirds of these jobs could disappear by 2020 as coal mines close all around Europe in response to the demand for cleaner fuel.
There's no doubt the EU's commitment to cut CO2 emissions as well as competition from lower emitting natural gas has put coal mining regions in a difficult situation. So how is the EU supporting them?
Well, over the past years, the Commission has approved public funding to facilitate the closure of uncompetitive mines in several member states, such as Romania, Spain and Hungary. In these cases, the aid aimed at helping laid-off workers retrain and find a new job, alleviating the social and environmental impact of the mine closures without distorting competition in the single market.
Another example of state aid authorised by the EU is the public economic support for the banking sector during the 2008 financial crisis, and that was a big operation.
It certainly was. In the space of 3 years between 2008 and 2011, the Commission approved some 4.5 trillion euros of state aid measures to rescue over 100 EU banks in distress. That's the equivalent of 37% of the EU GDP.
The banking sector is a vital component of the economy, so the financial support granted by many member states in order to rescue their credit institutions was necessary to prevent widespread disruption on the financial markets and in the real economy. However, the EU learned its lesson and started quickly building up a set of common tools and mechanisms to prevent this from ever happening again.
The digital economy is another area where state aid has been used, although not in the form of public support for companies in need, but rather for those aiming to attract desired investments.
This has been the case with large tech giants to whom some member states, Ireland in the case of Apple and Luxembourg in the case of Amazon, have tried to attract through extremely generous tax arrangements.
Both cases have been the subject of long investigations and vivid legal and media debates, but in the end, they were found to be in breach of EU state aid rules, and both countries were asked to recover the money lost.
Another creative way to use public aid without violating EU state aid rules is through the establishment of so-called special economic zones, which offer an attractive combination of tax and tariff incentives, streamlined customs procedures, fewer regulations, infrastructure provisions, and the creation of business clusters, with the aim of attracting local and foreign investment to enhance trade, employment, and industrial development.
In 2019, there were more than 70 free zones in the EU, 11 of them in Croatia, although the exact conditions offered by these areas are not always clear and in some cases have forced the Commission to open in-depth investigations.
In 2012, the Commission embarked on a major reform of EU state aid rules and is currently evaluating some of them, which are due to expire by the end of 2020, although they will probably be prolonged for another 2 years.
So what's the European Parliament's take on this? Stay with us.
Well, the European Parliament has a twofold stance here. On the one hand, it is in favour of using better targeted state aid, for example, to support member states' ecological transformation and foster the development of services, knowledge and infrastructure, rather than providing support to specific companies.
On the other hand, it wants the Commission to ensure that state aid will be reduced in the long term, given its distortive effects on the internal market. So while recognising that the temporary state aid to the financial sector to stabilise the EU financial system might have been necessary, the European Parliament calls on the Commission to further scrutinise this aid.
The Parliament also calls on the Member States to abandon unfair competition practices based on unjustified tax incentives and asks the Council to speed up the adoption of a single set of rules to calculate companies' taxable profits in the EU.
You're listening to the European Parliamentary Research Service podcasts.